As General William Tecumseh Sherman liked to say, war is hell. Although it didn't stop him making a career out of it. Any general, when not telling you how much they hate their job, will tell you war is a complex business. But the truth is, it's alarmingly easy to persuade people they should be knocking lumps out of each other. The problem is stopping them once the shooting starts. So, before you go over the top, time to head to boot camp. Here's how to wage a war. There's an awful lot of history in the world. Too much, really. So, let's skip all the boring stuff and get straight to the interesting bits. Sit back while we bring you the surprising, funny, frightening, and sometimes downright odd. True stories about what people in the past were getting up to, and how to make it all work for you. This is history. The interesting bits. History shows that people will find any excuse to go to war if they want to. And as we shall see, sometimes a lost ear or a French pastry can be enough to light the fuse.
Clausewitz, the great German philosopher of war, said that war is politics continued by other means. So when you are fighting a war for political ends. If you are not seeking political ends, you are just a murderer.
Of course, it's not always easy to tell the difference. As handsomely demonstrated by one of history's biggest human tragedies, the First World War, known to its fans as the Great War. Which it definitely wasn't for most of those who were in it. But how do you start a global conflagration? To find the origins of one of history's bloodiest wars, come with us to the Balkans and meet the gang, the Black Hand Gang. With a less than life-affirming motto of unification or death, these Serbian nationalists wanted Bosnia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to be unified with Serbia, which wasn't. They didn't plan to start a world war, but they did want to liberate the Slav people from Austro-Hungarian rule, which it turns out amounted to pretty much the same thing. Because the Black Hand Gang decided that the best way to make their case was killing someone. Namely, this man in the chicken hat, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And as far as the Black Hand Gang are concerned, public enemy number 2, after the emperor himself, of course. So when, in the summer of 1914, Franz and his lovely wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo, they found a whole bunch of desperados waiting to kill them. But the would-be assassins were new to all this. Nedeljko Chabrinovic threw his bomb at the Duke's motorcade, but missed, and instead wounded many others. Seeing the game was up, Nedeljko swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into the river. Sadly for him, the pill just made him throw up on himself, and as the river was only 4 inches deep, he was neither poisoned nor drowned, but was instead busted. History suggests that trying to fix the world by killing someone important rarely turns out well. 19-year-old religious fanatic Jean Chatel lunged at King Henry IV of France in 1594 with a knife as part of a Jesuit assassination plot, but only managed to scratch the royal lip. The king's response was considerably more enthusiastic. Before dismembering him, Henry had his would-be assassin's hand burnt off in a bucket of molten sulfur. Still not satisfied, he then had the whole Jesuit order kicked out of France. Confirmation of the immortal words of Omar Little, if you come at the king, you'd best not miss. Britain's Queen Victoria was the target of several assassination attempts, but all missed the mark. One reportedly foiled by a couple of quick-thinking schoolboys with umbrellas. But by now, burning sulfur and grisly public executions were less fashionable, and none of the would-be assassins were executed. Even one that tried twice, and instead were banished, sentenced to hard labor, or thrown in an asylum. Back in Sarajevo, The royal visitors, with an admirable amount of stiff upper lip, went on with the day's events, attending a reception at the town hall, where the Governor-General Oskar Potiorek vetoed the idea of extra troops for protection. "Do you think Sarajevo is full of assassins?" he asked indignantly. The correct answer to that was, of course, yes. But even so, things could still have turned out better had Franz Ferdinand and Sophie not decided to change their schedule.
The Archduke says, actually, I think I'd rather like to go to the hospital and see my friends who were hurt by the bomb that was meant for me. And I think he says to Potiorek, so where are we going? Are we going to take a shortcut? I don't want to be at risk anymore. And what Potiorek does is take them back down the exact same road where the assassins were and puts him right back in the line of fire.
The confused driver, Leopold Leuker, took a wrong turn. And as they backed up, they passed Schiller's Delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip was taking a quick coffee break from his Black Hand gang duties. Gavrilo seized the moment, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 shots at the Archduke's car.
One definitely hits Franz Ferdinand here, just above the collarbone. Sophie doesn't look like she's hit, and then she starts screaming when he has blood coming out of his mouth, and then she passes out and faints. She actually dies on the way to the residence.
These black caskets carry Ferdinand and his wife to Vienna. They are the prelude to slaughter.
Undoubtedly not how you'd want to end any car journey, but how does this start one of the most cataclysmic wars in human history? This will take some explaining, so pay close attention. Austro-Hungary was just one of, frankly, far too many great powers in Europe in 1914, mainly ruled by a closely related group of men in chicken hats, who, despite their blood ties, didn't really get on at all.
Europe is ruled over by this extended family tree that mostly spawns from Queen Victoria, and it's a bit creepy. So Wilhelm, the German Kaiser, is our oldest grandchild. Willie. Nicholas II, who's married to another granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And then you've got, obviously, George V is her grandson as well.
Strangely, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were some of the few European royals not actually related to Queen Victoria. But that didn't stop the chicken hats getting hot under the collar when Franz and Sophie were murdered and all hell broke loose anyway.
Serbia get the blame for it because it's a Bosnian Serb that does it. Austria threatened Serbia. Serbia kind of roll over, but not completely. Austria have gone and got Germany to say that they'll back them up. That makes Russia angry, so Russia picks on Germany. Russia's friends with France, now Germany's going to pick on France as well. Poor Belgium's stuck in the middle because everyone's going to have to stomp through it. Luxembourg is as well, but they just roll over. Belgium want Britain to help them because there's some ancient pact promise that says that they should, but it not really. But Britain agrees anyway, mainly because if someone wins, they want stuff too.
And World War I was on. But if you think that seems like a poor reason to start shooting, how about these molehills that somehow turned into mountains? The flashpoint that led to the War of Jenkins' Ear came when, in 1731, Spanish coast guards stopped Robert Jenkins' merchant ship. They didn't just check his cargo for contraband, they trashed his boat and cut his ear off. But for the moment, that was that. Until some 7 years later, when hawks in the English Parliament were still trying to get everyone behind a war with the Spanish, who were unsportingly making it hard for England's slave traders and smugglers to do business with Spain's colonies across the Atlantic. Suddenly, someone remembered. Jenkins' Ear! Jenkins was called to the House of Commons and turned up waving a pickle jar containing his lost lug hull, which was enough for Parliament to justify declaring war on Spain. And yet, even this isn't the most unlikely or most belated reason for declaring a war. That distinction must surely go to the Pastry War. During the birth of the Mexican Republic, many foreign establishments in Mexico City were looted, including, in 1832, a pastry shop owned by a French expat named Monsieur Romontel, who oddly seems to have waited 10 years before taking his case to King Louis-Philippe of France. Seeing the chance to do something about all sorts of grievances with Mexico, Louis agreed to help. France demanded a staggering 600,000 pesos compensation. Monsieur Romontel must have sold some very expensive buns. The Mexicans weren't entirely sure whether this was a joke until the French blockaded the country and began to seize their possessions. So Mexico declared war on France and called their legendary General Santa Anna, he of the Alamo fame, back to the fray. At this point, it's worth noting that having General Santa Anna on your side could be a mixed blessing. Despite the big win at the Alamo, the self-styled Napoleon of the West had actually lost the war against the massively outnumbered and outgunned breakaway Texan Republic. The Pastry War didn't end well for him either. Following a skirmish with the French, he had to have his leg amputated, after which Mexico agreed to pay up, but never actually did. The only real winner was perhaps Santa Anna's leg, which was buried with full military honors. Once you've decided there is a war on, you'll need to tell someone about it, because if you don't, there's a risk nobody will turn up for the fight. Plus, it makes the whole thing nice and legal. In theory. The ancient Spartans used to declare war on their slaves every year, whether they were revolting or not. Their dubious logic was, if there is officially a war on, it's not murder when you kill them. The Romans had a special priest whose job it was to lob a spear into soon-to-be enemy territory, which, as far as Rome was concerned, was fair warning that a lot more Romans were on their way with a lot more spears. Actually, for most of recorded history, making a formal declaration of war has been pretty much optional. But since the early 20th century, there have been rules you should stick to, or else it's considered cheating. According to an international convention signed in 1907, you're obliged to give notice that you're about to start hostilities. Unless, of course, you are Imperial Japan about to launch a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet, and you forget to tell the Americans you're coming. The message only arrived after the Japanese planes started delivering their bombs on Hawaii. But how or when you decide to fire the starting gun, it's important that everyone knows that you are the one they should all be rooting for. Good guys don't start wars, right? But you're a good guy. Just ask anyone. Go ahead. Ask them. However flaky your pretext for starting a war, it's vital it doesn't look like it's your fault. One way to do that is to pretend the other lot started it, known as false flag operations. The idea of a fake attack staged against your own side is a favorite of conspiracy theorists. But even in the real world, it does sometimes happen. World War II began with Nazi troops attacking German border posts dressed in Polish uniforms to justify Hitler's invasion of Poland, in what was officially called Operation Himmler. But if false flags seem too stagey, you could just tell everyone the war you're starting is okay because it's what God wants. And who better to take the moral high ground than the Supreme Pontiff himself, the Pope? In 1095, Pope Urban II saw a convenient way to get the hordes of medieval Christian knights, then terrorizing each other, to go and terrorize someone beyond Christian Europe. So he spread a doubtful rumor that Muslims in the Holy Land were committing atrocities against Christian pilgrims, including forced circumcision. Whilst it's hard to know whether cutting off Christian heads or Christian foreskins was considered the more heinous crime, his bold call to protect foreskins launched tens of thousands of angry Christian crusaders on the Middle East and ignited a conflict that ran on for centuries and still resonates today. But given what a grisly business war is, taking and holding any sort of moral high ground can be a bit of a challenge. Back in Sarajevo, once Gavrilo Princip had fired the starting gun on the war, the spin doctors on all sides set to work, making everything look like someone else's fault. Like every other aspect of World War I, the production of fake news was on an industrial scale, with increasingly outrageous stories concocted to win over hearts and minds, particularly in the still neutral US. Allied propaganda went to town, reporting, exaggerating, and, where necessary, making up stories, until the Germans were not just guilty of marching uninvited into Belgium and France, but were also baby-killing, Canadian-crucifying barbarians of the very worst sort. They even stole Christmas! By World War II, radio had made it possible to beam your messages directly into the homes of your enemies. But peddling fake news to prop up totalitarian regimes can often get you in a pickle, as the American-born pro-Nazi broadcaster Jane Anderson found out. Jane, known as the Georgia Peach, made her first broadcast to the Allies from Germany on the 14th of April 1941, lavishing praise on Hitler, calling him an immortal crusader, a great lover of God. A highly unusual broadcaster, she ended each broadcast with the peculiar message, "Always remember, progressive Americans eat Kellogg's cornflakes and listen to both sides of the story." In a 1942 message, Jane boasted to her US audience of how little the war was touching life in the Reich, gloating about the Turkish cakes, champagne and cognac she'd recently enjoyed in a Berlin cocktail bar. The Americans simply recorded the broadcast and played it back to Germany, where thousands of people heard about her privileged life of cake and champagne, while much of war-rationed Germany was eating turnips. The result was outrage, and the Nazis removed the Georgia Peach from the menu.
My own sense is that, like propaganda can be proper deception, right? Intelligence, creating pretexts for war, the sort of deception and deceit and fracturing political coalitions can be very important. But at the end of the day, when people are shooting, right, the human instinct is to rally to the flag. The Japanese had Tokyo Rose during the Second World War, right, who would speak in English to American soldiers and propagandize against them and tell them they were going to lose. Well, they didn't lose. They won. At the end of the day, what mattered was people on the battlefield.
And one way to make sure you have enough people on the battlefield is by calling on your adoring public to pay for the war.
And now, for many happy returns, follow the musical advice of Bing Crosby in the United States Maritime Service Training Station Choir from Avalon, California.
During World War II, America used glitz, glamour, and Hollywood stars to encourage citizens to raise funds by purchasing war bonds. But north of the border, methods ran to the more unconventional. The people of Winnipeg awoke on the 19th of February 1942 to find Nazi troops patrolling the city. As dawn broke, there were running battles, air raid sirens, burning bridges, and radio broadcasts announcing the takeover. By 9:30, the defenders had surrendered, and a tank rolled down Main Street. The swastika was hauled up over a city that was renamed Himmlerstadt. But don't look for it on the map. This was the most elaborate exercise in selling war bonds in Canadian history. Under the jackboot, Winnipeg raised over $3.2 million in 24 hours. The Nazis were thousands of volunteers uniformed courtesy of Hollywood studios. There had been announcements on the days leading up to the event, but there's no record of how many Canadians were taken completely by surprise by this horrific but hugely effective propaganda stunt. If you're having a really big war, there is a chance you'll need more than people's money. You might also want them to stake their life in the service of their country. In World War I, patriotism was key to persuading all kinds of people into uniform who would never normally consider soldiering as a career option. In Britain, groups of friends, neighbours and co-workers were encouraged to sign up together into what quickly became known as PALS battalions. Lord Kitchener became the face of the campaign with his iconic "Your country needs you" posters. Which, given the war was consuming more than 5,000 lives a day, it certainly did. Margot Asquith, wife of the British Prime Minister, said of Kitchener, though not a great man, he is a great poster. His pointing finger became a propaganda classic, proving again that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But once they sign up for the cause, will they regret their decision? That depends on what you do next. No matter how good you are at winning over hearts and minds, war is a messy and dangerous business. When it comes to death or glory, it's the death bit that is usually most frequently encountered. Because once you've started a war, someone is going to get hurt. Actually, quite a lot of people. And most of them aren't even soldiers. While World War I stands out for its immense cost in human lives, it's not even at the top of the leaderboard. That dubious honour belongs to World War II. There are at least half a dozen wars through history where the death toll runs into tens of millions. Ideally, you'd like to find ways to avoid these horrors. So what can you do? Well, for starters, you can try and keep a lid on the amount of actual fighting that happens. Strangely, the longest war in history managed exactly that. No battles, no sieges, no casualties. In fact, no one even fired a shot. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, King Charles's royalist fleet had been forced to retreat to the tiny Isles of Scilly, 28 miles off Cornwall in the Atlantic Ocean. Here they happily took to raising funds by raiding Dutch ships, which they would capture and then ransom back to their owners. Unsurprisingly, this annoyed the Dutch, and so in 1651, Lieutenant Admiral Martin Harpetszoon Tromp arrived in Scilly to demand they stop it. When they refused, he declared war. And then he went home, and everyone forgot about the whole thing. Until 1985, when the chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council was informed by the Dutch that no peace treaty had been signed, so strictly speaking, they were still at war. Peace was declared in 1986, allowing the Dutch once again to sleep soundly in their beds. If it looks like fighting can't be avoided, maybe it's best to keep your war as short as possible. How does 38 minutes sound? In 1896, following the sudden death of the pro-British Sultan of Zanzibar, his rather less pro-British nephew, Khalid bin Bargash, declared himself the new ruler. 3 British cruisers and 2 gunboats begged to differ and sailed into the harbour to remind him how lucky Zanzibar was to be a British protectorate. But Khalid wasn't backing down. He aimed his ancient cannon at Her Majesty's Navy and barricaded himself into the palace with around 2,800 defenders. At 8 a.m. on August the 27th, the British again requested Khalid step down. An hour and 2 minutes later, they opened fire, immediately destroying Khalid's artillery and sinking the only ship in his fleet. After 38 minutes of bombardment, the Sultan's palace lay in ruins, along with many of its defenders, and Khalid fled into exile. By afternoon tea, the British had installed a friendly new Sultan, and normal service was resumed. The best way to get it over with quickly is massively to outgun your enemy. As seen in 1893, when the Queen of Hawaii was overthrown in a single day, as she didn't actually have an army at all. Getting your licks in first can also be a splendidly effective way of getting it all over with quickly. As Israel demonstrated in their lightning preemptive strike in 1967, which devastated the armed forces of its Arab neighbors in just 6 days.
Israel had driven to the Suez Canal.
However, ending the war quickly isn't the same thing as winning the peace, as the continuing disputes in the Middle East demonstrate. Even if everything seems to have gone to plan, all too often, early successes can turn sour. Meet Hannibal. He's mostly famous for dragging a herd of elephants over the tallest mountains in Europe and using them to squash Romans. But mountains and elephants don't really mix, and not many of his secret weapons made it over the Alps. Fortunately, it turned out his army could do just fine without them, crushing one Roman army, losing most of the remaining elephants in the process, and then ambushing another one, with no elephants involved. Perhaps heartened by his elephant-free status, the Romans then mustered the biggest army they'd ever raised, perhaps 80,000 men, against him. Big mistake. Hannibal's army killed more Romans than anyone ever had. With over 50,000 deaths, the Battle of Cannae is possibly the bloodiest day of battle in all recorded history. Hannibal could be forgiven for thinking the Romans would now give up, and they did, just not the way he thought they would. The Romans shifted tactics and stopped fighting him, instead attacking anyone who was even thinking about joining his side. Hannibal was left to wander around Italy for over a decade, looking for a fight, but not getting one, and without enough men or supplies ever to take Rome itself. Eventually, Hannibal was forced to abandon his Italian holiday and head to North Africa to defend his homeland from, you guessed it, the Romans. Where, despite having a bigger army and 80 brand spanking new elephants, he lost. History tells us that the most ambitious warmongers can be their own worst enemy. Possibly the most famous example of biting off more than you can chew is this man, Napoleon Bonaparte. whose meteoric rise through the ranks of France's revolutionary army made him the ideal candidate to draw a line under all that revolution stuff, declare himself emperor, and set France on the path to world domination. Of course, not everyone agreed, and many nations came to blows with him. But Bonaparte kept beating them. Until Russia. In the summer of 1812, as they marched through Lithuania to attack Moscow, the French army erected an understated monument, declaring, "Napoleon Bonaparte passed this way in 1812 with 400,000 men." Following their crushing defeat by the Russians, and most particularly the Russian winter, the other side of the monument received a new inscription. "Napoleon Bonaparte passed this way in 1812 with 9,000 men." Ouch. So when it comes to putting your plan together, it might be best to steer clear of world domination. Genghis Khan had a very good go at it, probably history's most successful conqueror. But as we shall see, there was a downside. Alexander the Great also came close, only held back by his army's homesickness and a dawning realization that the whole world might be considerably bigger than he had initially thought. In more recent times, the size of the planet was no obstacle to Western powers, who took to traveling the world, invading other countries like they were on a particularly violent shopping spree. But not everybody gave up as quickly as the Sultan of Zanzibar. In fact, some of these modern armies took a severe beating from indignant and outgunned locals. General Custer found this out in 1876 at the Little Bighorn, when he launched a cavalry attack on the joint campsite of several Native American tribes. He may have expected an easy victory of modern tactics and cavalry dash over a disorganized and surprised enemy. But the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne and Arapaho proved more than a match for the 7th Cavalry, thanks to their unflinching desire to protect their homelands and people. And in part aided by shiny new repeating rifles sold to them by entrepreneurial frontier traders. Custer only succeeded in getting himself and most of the regiment killed. An overconfident British force was equally blooded in Zululand in 1879, when their 1,500 men were annihilated by a Zulu army of over 20,000 that somehow nobody saw coming, until too late. Leaving it to the spin doctors to turn embarrassing defeat into stirring tales of heroism and the odd nice painting. Or in the case of General Custer, and with customary American razzmatazz, a thrilling circus act starring some of the men who actually killed him. But no amount of painting or acting can alter one stark military truth. If you're going to war, you'd better come out on top. It's all very well having a goal and some kind of plan for your war, but you're going to need someone to fight it. And not just anyone. Ideally, you want history's deadliest warriors. There's no point endlessly debating whether the SAS could take down the Green Berets or could a Viking berserker poleaxe a samurai. We'll never know, so stop worrying about it. Better to ask, can an army that's highly trained, better motivated, and just plain tougher than anyone else's tip the scales of victory? What about history's most famous tough guys? The Spartans! Spartans loved to fight, and there was nothing they enjoyed more than a local derby with their rivals in the city of Argos. So, in 546 BCE, trying to avoid all-out war, the Spartans and the Argives selected 300 champions, each to fight out their differences. To the death! By the end of it, according to legend, just 2 blood-soaked Argives were left. Declaring themselves winners, they limped home for a ticker-tape parade. Unfortunately, one of the Spartans wasn't quite dead, and as he was the last man alive on the battlefield, he was declared the winner on a technicality. And then he killed himself. With the result of the battle now in dispute, a full war kicked off, which the Spartans won. So, if being tough isn't enough to secure victory, what about being sneakier than anyone else? In 12th century Japan, samurai commander Minamoto no Yoshitsune is said to have used shinobi, known today as ninjas, against his enemies. In those days, being sneaky was considered unworthy of a samurai, but not if you paid someone else to do it for you. Which is why the shinobi emerged, ready to scout, sabotage and assassinate, all in return for hard cash. The shinobi became so successful that they organized themselves into clans. Of course, if a noble samurai was resistant to employing shinobi warriors, he always had the option of hiring a less picky operator. But assuming history's deadliest warriors are busy washing their hair and can't come to your war, perhaps a super weapon might tip the balance. As Hitler's nightmarish vision of world domination unraveled, he hoped wonder weapons could get the fatherland back on the rise again. German scientists came up with remote-controlled vehicles, flying bombs, V-2 rockets, and jet-engine warplanes. And one innovation way ahead of its time, a bomb called Fritz. Fritz X was air-launched, wirelessly guided, armor-piercing, and high-explosive, all of which are considered good things in a bomb. And the Germans managed to sink at least one ship with a Fritz. An Italian one, because their former fascist friends had just surrendered to the Allies. In truth, by this point in the war, there was not the manpower or the resources to make enough superweapons to save the crumbling Nazi regime. But they did save some of the scientists who invented them, like Werner von Braun, whose research on rocket-powered vengeance weapons led to a comfortable post-war career with the victorious Allies.
This is a model of the U.S. Army's Redstone guided missile.
Bringing the latest superweapon to the battlefield is nothing new. Back in the 3rd century BCE, elephants were the must-have new technology for aspiring warlords. Hannibal wasn't even the first person to turn up in Italy with them. He was just the one who made them walk there over a mountain. Pyrrhus crossed over to Italy from Greece with his elephants, 60 years before Hannibal even thought about it. And it went well. So well that Pyrrhic is now a word for a victory so costly you couldn't afford another one. War elephants looked good, but they could be dealt with by clever tricks like getting out of the way, as seen in this rare film, or by unleashing war pigs to scare them off with their terrifying piggy squeals. In fact, elephants were something of a liability, as they don't particularly enjoy being stabbed, shot at, or charged, and tend to take that out on the people who got them into this mess in the first place. An elephant driver's main weapon was a hammer and chisel to dispatch the elephant if it started trampling its own side. If animal superweapons are unpredictable, then maybe what you need is a reliable machine. But for every groundbreaking design that does what you want it to, there's another that behaves as erratically as a war elephant spooked by a burning war pig. Most people agree that a battleship should be longer than it is wide, with a pointy front end. That is, unless you're Russian Vice Admiral A.A. Popov, who in 1870 decided that 5,000 years of naval architecture was wrong and ships should be round and look a bit like a drowning UFO. His new ships were driven by 6 engines and sported a pair of 11-inch guns. And one of them was named, as is only right, after Rear Admiral Popov. As it turned out, there were very good reasons why circular ships had never been the popular choice. These flat-bottomed Popovkas were slow, almost impossible to steer, and tended to be swept away by currents. They also made their crews hopelessly seasick. The legend goes that when you fired the guns, the ship span around like a roulette wheel, with a 50-50 chance of coming to a stop with the guns pointing back at their own side. The Popovkas were quietly retired, much to the relief of their crews. Surprisingly, the Russians didn't hold a grudge. Popov even got a commemorative stamp. But before you laugh too heartily, sometimes madcap schemes work and change the way wars are fought forever. It was towards the end of January 1916 that British engineers began making unusual alterations to the 4th Marquess of Salisbury's private golf course at Hatfield House. They blasted their way out of the bunkers, drove trenches through the fairways, and pitched barbed wire across the greens. Then they spread rumours that the huge tarpaulin-covered machine perched on the nearby hill was a motorised water pump. But it was actually a revolutionary weapon. On the 29th of January, Her Majesty's Landship Centipede, known to its creators as Mother or Big Willie, and to all succeeding generations as the world's first tank, was revealed. The golf course was her training ground, and Mother played a stellar round. Almost on the spot, the Army Council placed an order for 100 tanks, and so began a new era in warfare. Messaging has always been a vital element in warfare, allowing commanders to relay their instructions to the front line, and allowing the front line to tell the commanders exactly what they think of them. But there are risks. In 1917, the nightmare facing the German Kaiser was that the Americans might join World War I on the side of the Allies. So they came up with a plan to keep them busy. It all started with a telegram to Mexico.
Basically, the Zimmermann telegram is Germany saying to Mexico, hey, if you invade America from the south and help us out, we'll let you keep Arizona and Mexico, Texas, and you can make it all part of Mexico.
What its author, German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs Alfred Zimmermann, didn't realize was that all telegraph cables from Germany to the Americas were routed through a government building in London, where the occupants rudely read it and passed it on to US President Woodrow Wilson.
It completely undermines that Germany have, on the other hand, been saying to President Wilson, oh yeah, we could do with peace, yeah, we could come to the table, we don't have any angry intentions towards anybody. Well, it flattens that completely. So it definitely, I think, is the point where Wilson realises that his chances of getting everybody to the table to talk and find peace are non-existent.
Wilson declared war on Germany, and Kaiser Wilhelm's nightmare came true, probably making him wish he hadn't started the war in the first place. When your war has become unwinnable, it's time to think about wrapping the whole business up. All good things must come to an end, and so must all bad things. But how do you know who's won in the end? It's not just looking at the scorecard of battles lost and battles won. George Washington famously fought 17 battles. Lost 7, drew 4, won 6. You can't get a more mixed scorecard than that. But it was enough to win America's independence from Britain. Of course, there was that awkward rematch in 1812, which is still a source of confusion. For starters, despite being called the War of 1812, it trundled along happily until January 1815, when Andrew Jackson finally got to give the Brits a bloody nose at the Battle of New Orleans. Only to find out the war was already over. A peace treaty had been signed in Europe in December 1814, but the paperwork hadn't yet arrived back in America. Even today, nobody can agree on who won. Except the Canadians, who, as the Americans invaded, are pretty sure there wouldn't be a Canada if the US had won. But the biggest winner was perhaps Jackson, who, as a famous war hero, was lined up as a future president of the United States. The war, started by Gavrilo Princip's unlucky shot in Sarajevo, famously ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, with a victory for the British, French, and US Allied powers. Unfortunately, the war wasn't really over. November 1918 was only an armistice. In the short term, it mostly stopped the shooting and the bombing and the gassing. But the actual end of the war only came 9 months later in 1919, when everyone agreed to the Treaty of Versailles. Once you sign on the dotted line, it's time, belatedly, to think about the repercussions of your actions.
War's a costly business, especially if you started it and people want compensation. Germany was held to be solely responsible for World War I by the winners in the Treaty of Versailles. They were handed a bill that in modern money comes to about $500 billion. But the price of World War I still wouldn't buy you a majority share in Apple 100 years later in 2019. Thanks to hyperinflation, Adolf Hitler, and a lot of write-downs, most of that German debt went unpaid until after World War II. The final payment was made in September 2010.
By the time the Second World War ended, there wasn't much negotiation to be done, and Japan and Germany were left with only one option. The costliest war in human history would require more than just a polite apology before everyone could move on. And for Imperial Japan, holding out to the bitter end invited the most devastating end to a war yet seen by humankind.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
As the possibly radioactive dust settles, it's time to confront the real terrible cost of your war, measured not in cash, but in human lives.
The 20th century seems to have been the most lethal in history. In 1914, the world's population was 1.75 billion, and the war resulted in perhaps 15 million deaths. But then immediately after the war, there was a major pandemic, Spanish influenza, that killed more people than the war had done. While World War II was underway, there were 2 billion people on the planet when it started, and at least 66 million deaths. On the face of it, that's 3.3% of the world's population lost. But in the same time period to 1945, the global population grew to about 2.35 billion because births far outstripped deaths. And advances in medical science and hygiene were outpacing advances in killing people. But to find a war that really dented humanity, we have to reach back hundreds of years to the time Genghis Khan. It's estimated there were 360 million on the planet at the time, around the year 1200. And some historians believe Genghis's conquests resulted in the deaths of 10% of them.
Whatever the scale, there's no denying that Sherman was right. War is hell.
War is awful beyond the ability of those of us who have never experienced it to imagine. War, modern war, with its incredible levels of violence, is carnage and horrors and misery of a sort that literature or movies cannot even begin to convey. Most of us in our modern sort of comfortable lives are so isolated from the reality of war and what it means that we probably can't even conceive of the level of trauma. But the horror of war, the fact that war is an incredibly bad thing, does not mean that it is always the worst thing. No one would look at World War II and say, well, I wish we hadn't fought it. Even making that statement would be madness. Of course it was worth fighting. Of course it had to be done. The alternative was so much worse.
So let's assume you've had a good war, for all the right reasons, and won. Well, be careful. Nobody likes a show-off. When Australian World War I veterans returned home, fresh from defeating Germany, a new and ruthless enemy awaited them. Emus. Millions of them.
There are too many emus in Australia after the First World War. Farming's been on the up, so the land has been cleared and there's water sources, and the emus are like, oh wow, this is great, and the farmers aren't, well it isn't, because you're eating my crops and I hate you.
Such was the scale of the problem that by 1932, the army had been called in.
They send in a machine gun specialist from the First World War and 2 other guys. So they go in with their light machine guns to take care of the emus, and then the emus just make fun of them. They basically start breaking off into little bands of guerrilla fighters and running rings around them and make them look very, very silly. So it was a proper war against these emus.
The Australian commander declared, if we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. A month and a half into the war, the same Australian commander was forced to admit defeat. They had won the First World War, but lost to a flock of emus. So what have we learnt? After thousands of years of human existence, when it comes to war, not much. But if you insist on it, then make sure it doesn't look like your fault. Always pickle any chopped off body parts. You might need them later. Never steal pastries from the French. You'll never win an argument with a Spartan. And giant flightless birds make formidable foes.